Hey everybody, I'm Tim Mooney with the Timothy Mooney Repertory Theater. So today I'm continuing with yet another of our series on Shakespeare's histories, on my way to explore all 10 history plays, this time with the fourth of the plays, Henry IV Part 2. I perform portions of Henry IV Part 2 as part of my one-man play, Shakespeare's Histories, 10 Epic Plays at a Breakneck Pace, which I'll be doing live online Sunday and Monday, March 28th and 29th at 8 p.m. Central, 2021. You can catch it as a pay whatever you want event on Facebook Live on Sunday, and for just $5 on Zoom on Monday. My plan here is to shine just a little more light into what may seem like a very tangled political or rhetorical web, and perhaps give you a sense of just what Shakespeare might have wanted his audience to get out of that. So here's I Finally Get Henry IV Part 2. First thing you need to know is something that every Shakespeare scholar knows, but what very few will say out loud. Henry IV Part 2 is not as good as Henry IV Part 1. Isaac Asimov, in his brilliant book Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare, puts forward a theory that Shakespeare was not planning on writing a second part to Henry IV Part 1. Part 1 really does stand up on its own. It's a fun redemption story about Hal, as measured against his all-play, no-work drinking companion Falstaff, and his all-work, no-play nemesis Hotspur. Hal manages to outwit Falstaff, making him look like a buffoon, and he manages to outfight Hotspur, making him dead. And in the process, he redeems himself in the eyes of his father, who had begun to doubt his son's love and his ability to effectively lead the country after his death. You can check out what I had to say about that play here. Well, Shakespeare pretty much resolved that question, and father and son are reunited and reassured following the Battle of Shrewsbury at the end of Henry IV Part 1. There's minor cleaning up yet to be resolved, chasing down and fighting off the remnants of the bad guys, and that's alluded to, but not really looming as a huge threat. Sure, it's still only 1403, and Henry IV wasn't to die until 1413, but Shakespeare would be perfectly capable of jumping that span with, say, an epilogue. But Asimov suggests that perhaps halfway through writing Part 1, Shakespeare realized that Sir John Falstaff was just really too good of a character to let go of, and that a Part 2 to this saga would sell fairly well, presumably heightening the excitement for the climax of Henry V. Of course, we must continue to remind ourselves that these two plays were actually plays 2 and 3 of a 4-part saga, because Part 1 had been Richard II, which told the tale of how Henry IV stole the crown in the first place. You can go back to refresh yourself on Richard II here. And so, in writing Henry IV Part 2, Shakespeare must essentially desatisfy the satisfying conclusion of Part 1 and resolve its resolved problems. In doing so, Shakespeare has to approach Part 2 a little differently. This one is much more about Jack Falstaff, who only barely touches base with his buddy Prince Hal on a couple of occasions, but is up to his old tricks as a lovable old fat lecher who drinks too much, indulges himself with some women of a certain profession, and barely keeps out of trouble with the law. He begs and borrows money from everybody. He is commissioned to draft a troop of soldiers, but takes bribes from half of them, mostly the only promising fighters in the group, letting them go about their business while dragging a ragtag handful of straggling wastrels into battle. You may remember that at the end of Henry IV Part 1, Falstaff managed to take credit for the killing of Hotspur, which is probably the only reason he's been entrusted to this commission to begin with, and the police still have him on their radar. Metaphorically speaking, of course, they didn't have radar back then, for stealing a load of money from a group of traveling pilgrims. Money that Prince Hal returned when Falstaff wasn't looking. So the only thing that's keeping him out of prison is probably the friendship of Prince Hal and the somewhat shaky, unearned war hero reputation from the Battle of Shrewsbury. Falstaff largely manages to keep himself out of trouble through his usual diet of lies and evasiveness. The Chief Justice really wants to crack down on this ribald, lecherous troublemaker, but Falstaff manages to evade responsibility by pretending to be deaf, misunderstanding the Chief Justice's questioning, and providing oblique, unrelated answers to direct questions. Part of the problem with scenes like this is that oblique evasiveness in heavy accented pre-modern dialogue is really hard for a 21st century audience to follow. However riotously hilarious it may have been to the viewer from the time of Queen Elizabeth I. While Falstaff is supposed to be on his way to fight Northumberland in the north, and Hal is destined to go to another battle against Glendower in Wales, both are making one last stop at their favorite tavern in London for one last round of playful hijinks, ending in the usual outrageous lies and equivocation from Falstaff before they all head off to the wars again. Hal's one night of frivolity in London does not go unnoticed by King Henry, and all of the king's mistrust of his son in Part 1 creeps back into his attitude in Part 2. And all of that redemption Hal earned is quickly wiped away in Part 2, leaving his father doubtful and restless. Literally restless. King Henry is suffering from insomnia, and this time around is not going off to the battles, but remains behind, brooding and ruminating. Shakespeare drives this point home at great length. I would say he hits us over the head with it, were it not such a beautiful speech, but he's really going out of his way to set up a brilliant theatrical confrontation, and he needs to remind us of just how hard it is for Henry to catch a couple of winks. This brief cutting is less than half of the full speech, but how many thousand of my poorest subjects are at this hour asleep? O sleep, O gentle sleep, wilt thou upon the high and giddy mast seal up the shipboy's eyes, and rock his brains in the cradle of the rude imperious surge? Canst thou, O partial sleep, give thy repose to the wet sea-boy in an hour so rude, and in the calmest and most stillest night deny it to a king? Then happy low lie down, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. While King Henry continues to walk the halls restlessly, Shakespeare reminds us that there's still battling to do, mostly in the north. Northumberland, who coincidentally was a little too under the weather to bring his army to the Battle of Shrewsbury in Part 1, under the influence of a little arm twisting from his wife and daughter-in-law, again takes the coward's way out, leaving the lords Hastings, Mowbray, and the Archbishop of York and their armies to fight without him. It may be that Northumberland's absence leads the three rebels to give in more quickly than they otherwise might, but when Prince Hal's younger brother, John of Lancaster, swears agreement to all the rebels' demands, they pledge to break off their rebellion and send their troops home. It turns out that they send the troops home too quickly, because even as the happy troops are dispersing, Prince John arrests Hastings, Mowbray, and York for treason, sending them to their ultimate execution. This is really considered to be a nasty trick, outside all sense of honor, chivalry, and fair play, and what's interesting is that Shakespeare puts this bit of cold-blooded treachery into the hands of Prince John of Lancaster, rather than the man who actually pulled it off, the Lord Westmoreland. It's worth wondering why Shakespeare, some 7 generations after the fact, felt the need to malign Prince John in this way. At least one Shakespeare authorship theory suggests that the true author of these plays, not Shakespeare, might have been a direct descendant of Westmoreland, and was cleaning up the family reputation a bit. But the wars are pretty much resolved. Still at home, King Henry has a seizure of sorts and is put to bed, where at last he falls to sleep. Prince Hal returns to sit by his father, and while his father lies there sleeping, we and Hal wonder if he has died. Hal also rhapsodizes eloquently, this time about the nature of the crown that lies on the pillow beside him. Why doth the crown lie there upon his pillow, being so troublesome a bedfellow? By his gates of breath there lies a downy feather which stirs not. Did he suspire, that light and weightless down perforce must move. My gracious lord, my father. Ultimately, Hal assumes that his father, who notoriously can't sleep, must now have died, and carries the crown away to contemplate the heavy burden that now falls upon his shoulders. But of course, Dad's not dead yet, and awakes to find the crown gone. He confronts his son with another amazing speech, which I do as part of my performance of Shakespeare's Histories. You'll have to tune in to catch that one. And just as he did in part 1, Hal responds with more stirring words that win his father back. Coming to look on you, thinking you dead, and dead almost, my liege, to think you were, I spake unto this crown as having sense, and thus upbraided it. The care on thee depending hath fed upon the body of my father. Therefore, thou best of gold art worst of gold. Accusing it, I put it on my head, to try with it as with an enemy that had before my face murdered my father. But if it did infect my blood with joy, or swell my thoughts to any strain of pride, let God forever keep it from my head. And so Henry is again at last reconciled to his son, and dies with a sense of resolution and of peace. But now Prince Hal becomes King Henry V. And when Falstaff catches word of his buddy's pending coronation, he races to London promising, "The laws of England are at my commandment. Blessed are they that have been my friends, and woe to my Lord Chief Justice." The Chief Justice and Hal had a couple of run-ins back in the day of Hal's reckless youth, but now Hal, or more appropriately, King Henry, insists that the justice stay on in his position. When Falstaff arrives at the coronation, expectantly interrupting the ceremony with cries for, "My royal Hal, my sweet boy!" Hal turns on him, denounces him, and banishes him from his presence, not seemingly out of spite for Falstaff, but because the crown itself demands a respect that Falstaff is incapable of giving. As the new king, Hal owes an allegiance to the responsibilities that transcend former friendships. And if that sounds familiar to you, it may well be that you've seen similar moments in a recent Netflix series in which an entirely different Queen Elizabeth learns that she now has greater responsibility to the crown and the nation at large than all her former relations. And so, with his final rejection of his former life, Prince Hal is elevated to Henry V, thoroughly cleansed into the hero king that everybody in the audience knows is about to descend upon the English throne and history. And if you want to hear the story of that play, Henry V, you're going to want to subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss a single episode. So I finally get Henry IV Part 2. Hopefully your understanding of this bit of background will double your ability to get what's going on in this play. You'll also want to tune in to catch Shakespeare's History's 10 epic plays at a breakneck pace this Sunday and Monday, March 28th and 29th, 2021. All shows at 8 p.m. Central. If you're watching this video after those shows, please swing by timmooneyRep.com for all the latest details of the performance schedule, or to book an event for your own school, theater, or conference in person or via the internet. I do these explainer videos just about every other week, releasing them in advance of the coming shows. Hit like or subscribe. You can go back and see the first one I did on Shakespeare's Histories here, which will give you even more insight into the overall arc of these amazing 10 plays, and there you'll find more videos on lots of Shakespeare stuff. We've also got a Patreon campaign. If you'd like to support this work, we are a not-for-profit organization at patreon.com/TimMooneyRep. We could really use your support. We have giveaways of lots of swag, like this book on Shakespeare's Histories, as well as a new version of this book, The Breakneck Julius Caesar Companion, which, like the Histories book, now features easy-to-follow color maps. And this, and lots more goodies, can be found at timmooneyRep.com. Thanks for watching. See you on the stage.